What does it mean when 8 ambassadors, 8 symbols of global power, stand still in a golden-lit hallway, waiting not to instruct but to listen? What happens when they come not with demands but with open hands, not to dictate policy but to align with it? That was the scene in Ouagadougou on June 26, 2025. Inside the Cuba presidential palace, carved with the echoes of centuries, 8 foreign dignitaries stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in crisp suits and national colors, their documents held tight against their chests. Behind closed doors, the young leader they had once dismissed as a phase or a problem, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, was about to receive them. Not as a beggar, not as a rebel, but as the head of a sovereign African nation, one that no longer bowed. The red carpet stretched long and straight. No marching band played. No grand speech echoed through the marble halls. But the silence was louder than any anthem. Cameras rolled. The world watched. Burkina Faso, once seen as a small landlocked country scrambling for help, now stood tall. 8 embassies, 8 different flags, 8 nations, including former skeptics and strategic players, were lining up to pledge diplomatic partnership on Burkina Faso's terms. That wasn't just news. That was history rewritten. It was a shock. To Paris. To Brussels. To Washington. And to every government that once thought Africa would never dare walk without their permission. But how did it come to this? How did a young soldier with sand in his boots and a bullet scar on his left shoulder bring the world to his doorstep? Not to conquer, but to cooperate. Let's go back. Not too far. Just 3 years earlier, Burkina Faso was burning. Villages wiped out by terrorist attacks. Military aid from the West that seemed to vanish before it ever touched the ground. A puppet government too scared to speak, too weak to lead. Foreign troops walked the streets with more authority than local chiefs. Farmers were losing land, children were losing schools, and nobody in power had answers. Just apologies. Then came Traoré. He was only 34. A captain, not a general. Sharp eyes, calm voice, and a spine that refused to bend. He hadn't been born into politics. He rose from the same earth where miners dug gold they'd never see and mothers buried sons they'd never name. And he didn't ask to lead. But when the people marched, he stepped forward. Some called him reckless. Others called him a savior. He didn't care for either. He cared about the soil, the stories, the silence that had swallowed too many dreams. In a single night, the old government fell. Without bloodshed, but not without warning. Traoré appeared on national TV in military fatigues, eyes steady, voice level. This country will no longer be managed from outside. We will not host soldiers who cannot protect our children. We will not take loans that buy silence. We are not begging anymore. We are building. The people didn't cheer. Not at first. They listened. They waited. And when they saw French troops packing bags, when they saw schools being guarded by local forces, when grain reserves started refilling, not by donations but by reorganized trade, they began to believe. But belief has a price. As Traoré pushed out foreign influence, the pressure mounted. Drones began appearing in the skies. Disinformation campaigns spread rumors of coups. Even some senior officers began whispering behind closed doors. He's too young. Too bold. He'll bring war. But the grassroots held firm. Village elders who hadn't trusted any government in decades met with him. Student unions in Bobo-Dioulasso painted murals of Sankara next to Traoré. The old and the young, so often divided, began to share one hope, that this time, the revolution would not be hijacked. Diplomatic isolation followed. Western aid froze. Embassies closed. Burkina Faso was called unstable, aggressive, and in some corners of the media, lost to extremism. But Traoré didn't flinch. He doubled down. He sent envoys not to Europe, but to Havana, to Ankara, to Dhaka, to New Delhi. He looked east and south. Not for masters. For equals. And slowly the tide turned. India was first to respond. They remembered the non-aligned movement, the shared resistance to colonialism, the promise of mutual development. They didn't come with troops. They came with solar panels, ICT training, and agriculture experts. A shared belief, technology shouldn't be a weapon, it should be a ladder. Then came Turkey. with engineers and builders, hospitals, roads, even mosque restorations, not as a symbol of dominance, but of cultural respect. Talks of military cooperation followed, but on Burkina Faso's conditions. No bases. No strings. Cuba reached out too. The same Cuba that had once trained doctors for Sankara's Burkina Faso now offered to reopen that pipeline. Medical exchange, public health planning, and even youth leadership programs. The spirit of revolution was back. And this time, it wasn't nostalgic, it was strategic. One by one more followed. Gabon, recently freed from a dynasty, saw in Traoré a mirror. They spoke of ecological partnerships and border security. Not from above, but side by side. Equatorial Guinea, oil-rich and often underestimated, offered infrastructure deals, energy development, and cultural ties. Sierra Leone, scarred by war, shaped by survival, proposed joint peacekeeping training. Two nations that had known pain, learning how to protect peace. Even Luxembourg, small and western, sent an ambassador. Maybe to stay involved. Maybe to stay relevant. But they came. And they waited in that golden-lit hall just like the rest. And finally, Bangladesh. A rising force from South Asia, whose poverty-to-progress story inspired many. They spoke of microfinance, women's empowerment, and rural innovation. By June 26th, all 8 had confirmed. 8 letters of credence. 8 symbolic gestures. 8 quiet acknowledgments that something was shifting in Africa, and the center of gravity was no longer in Paris. It was in Ouagadougou. And as the last ambassador adjusted his collar and prepared to step into the presidential chamber, the doors creaked open. The room fell silent. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the chamber, not with a grand escort or flaring horns, but with the quiet force of someone who knew exactly what this moment meant. He wore his military fatigues, simple and sharp. No medals, no gold trim. Just the Burkinabe flag on his shoulder, and the determined look of a man who had seen too much to smile too easily. The first ambassador stepped forward. It was India's envoy, an older man with silver hair and warm eyes. He bowed slightly and offered the letter with both hands. Traoré accepted it with a nod. That handshake lasted 3 seconds. But across the world, newsrooms and ministries were still writing headlines about it hours later. Because in that one gesture, an entire story was being rewritten. Not about aid. Not about dependency. But about alliance. India and Burkina Faso. A new chapter. One forged not in boardrooms, but in fields and classrooms, in software labs and solar farms. For years, India had supported Burkina Faso quietly, sending experts, offering training, funding water projects. But now, the partnership was out in the open. Not transactional. Transformational. Next came Turkey's ambassador. The handshake here was firmer. 2 soldiers, speaking the language of grit. Turkey had been watching Traoré for some time, respecting his defiance, his insistence on national dignity. Turkey didn't ask for control, they offered projects. TICA, their development agency, had already built wells, schools, and clinics. Now they were talking defense, joint training, drone surveillance, and regional stability efforts. Behind the scenes, whispers suggested that Turkey was willing to provide military equipment with no strings attached. A direct challenge to the West's favorite tactic, conditional security. Then came Cuba. The Cuban ambassador was young, too young, some thought. But he had a voice that carried weight. His speech, brief and heartfelt, invoked the memory of Thomas Sankara and Fidel Castro. He called this moment a continuation of courage. He didn't just bring a letter. He brought a proposal: reopen the doctor exchange program. Send Cuban doctors. Train Burkinabe nurses. Rebuild public health, not for profit, but for people. When Traoré clasped his hand, both men smiled. Quietly. Like old friends reunited after a long silence. And then came Gabon. This handshake was different. Less warmth, more purpose. 2 leaders of countries that had recently said enough to foreign control. Gabon had thrown out its long-standing family dynasty just months before. Now, its new military-led transition was mirroring the Burkina Faso path, sovereignty first. Their conversation, brief but loaded, touched on regional security, resource management, and building African solidarity inside ECOWAS and ECAs, not around France. Equatorial Guinea followed. Small in size, powerful in energy. Their president hadn't sent an ambassador just to talk oil. He'd sent him to talk about the future. Joint infrastructure, energy grids, rail networks connecting West and Central Africa, without waiting for European partnerships that never delivered. This was African money, African ambition, African strategy. Sierra Leone's envoy was next. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. His country knew pain. Civil war, exploitation, broken promises. But it had rebuilt itself, inch by inch. Now, they offered what few could: knowledge in post-conflict healing, peacekeeping, community resilience. With Burkina Faso still fighting insurgents in its north, this wasn't just a friendly gesture, it was urgent. Then came the unexpected one: Luxembourg. Nobody had predicted they'd show up. Small, wealthy, and deeply tied to geopolitics, their appearance was a quiet strategy. A way for the West to keep a finger on the pulse of change without being center stage. They brought humanitarian proposals, some education grants. Traoré nodded respectfully, but he made no promises. This time, Burkina Faso would choose what stayed and what left. And finally, Bangladesh. Their ambassador looked proud. And rightly so. His country had done the impossible, rising from deep poverty through sheer innovation, focusing on rural communities, women's empowerment, and small industry. It was a story that resonated with Burkina Faso's new direction. No big banks. No fancy suits. Just smart policies that worked. Traoré's eyes didn't miss a thing during the entire procession. Every handshake, every sentence, every nuance. But behind the stillness, tension was building. Because outside those palace walls, not everyone was celebrating. The streets of Ouagadougou were alive with hope, yes. But also with whispers. Some claimed the West was planning to push back, harder this time. That secret meetings had taken place in neighboring capitals. That internal factions within the military were growing restless. Traoré had survived 3 rumored coup attempts in under a year. One was almost successful. He trusted very few now. Even among his closest circle, betrayal had become a possibility he had to live with daily. But he stood firm. This moment, 8 ambassadors, standing in recognition of his leadership, was the most visible sign yet that he wasn't alone. That his people weren't alone. Burkina Faso had cracked the wall. They had broken through the idea that small African nations had no agency unless Western capitals approved. That leadership had to look and sound like something imported. That era was ending. In the days that followed, newspapers in Europe scrambled to make sense of the new reality. Editorials warned of geopolitical fragmentation. TV analysts questioned whether Burkina Faso was becoming a threat or a model. In Ouagadougou, people danced in the streets. Not for the ambassadors, but for themselves. For the validation that their struggle had not been in vain. Still, deep in the night, Traoré sat alone in his study, the weight of every handshake resting on his shoulders. He knew this was just the beginning. New friends brought new hope, but also new expectations. And old enemies were still watching, closely. As the palace quieted and guards changed shift, a coded message buzzed on Traoré's encrypted line. His eyes narrowed as he read. Something had moved in the north. A betrayal was unfolding. The revolution had just gained global attention. But inside the country, the real test was about to begin. The night of June 27, 2025, was heavy with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the silence that comes before something breaks. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood in the dim light of his private office. The message he'd received just hours earlier was brief and direct. Movement detected. Northern base compromised. Internal intel leak confirmed. He knew what it meant. While the world applauded, someone had slipped a knife into the back of the revolution. For months, whispers of betrayal had hung in the air. Men he'd fought beside now looked away too quickly. Supplies meant for rural garrisons vanished without record. Intelligence missions returned with gaps. The timing of this breach, just one day after the historic diplomatic gathering, wasn't coincidence, it was warning. Still, Traoré didn't panic. He called no emergency meeting. He simply stood, stared at the red dot blinking on the map of the north, and picked up the phone. "Activate Plan Kurita," he said. That was the name they gave to the national defense protocol built not on imported systems, but on people. Volunteers. Hunters. Village guards. Women who could read drone paths from handmade maps. The Burkinabe resistance didn't wear uniforms. It wore scars. And it remembered. While ministers and commanders would later scramble to contain the leak, in that moment, Traoré turned to what he trusted most, the grassroots. Because this fight, this revolution, was never just about diplomacy. It was about who owned the story of Burkina Faso. And Traoré had long known that the real enemy didn't always carry a foreign flag. Sometimes it spoke his language, sat in his meetings, smiled in his face. That's what made sovereignty so hard. It wasn't just removing foreign control. It was confronting internal corruption, fear, and the temptation to settle for less. But now the world was watching. Across Africa, news of the eight-nation envoy had gone viral. In Senegal, student unions held forums on the Ouagadougou Declaration. In Mali and Niger, people took to the streets with Burkinabe flags and chants of Notre terre, nos règles, our land, our rules. Even in Europe, young African diaspora groups rallied outside embassies, holding up signs that read, "Africa is not your pawn." But in the north of Burkina Faso, a convoy of armed men, some local, some not, was advancing on a remote communication site. It wasn't just a military post. It was where encrypted signals from regional allies came through. If that fell, so would the backbone of their new diplomatic trust. The attack began at 3:17 a.m. Local fighters, armed with outdated rifles but unmatched resolve, held their ground. They had no air support, no elite squads. Just memory of sons lost, of promises made, of a leader who told them they mattered. By dawn, they had repelled the assault. Among the dead, they found something that sent a chill back to Ouagadougou. A former intelligence officer, once close to Traoré, discharged 6 months ago. Missing ever since. He had been on the payroll of a foreign contractor. One linked, discreetly, to a counterterrorism consulting group in France. The betrayal was confirmed. By midday, Traoré stood before the nation once more. This time, not from a palace room, but from the same dusty field in the southwest where he first addressed the people after taking power. No podium. No suit. Just a microphone and the wind at his back. "Yesterday," he began, "the world recognized our voice. Today, some tried to silence it." He paused. "They failed." Cheers erupted. "They failed because you, our mothers, our fathers, our farmers, our fighters, stood tall. Not for me. Not for a flag. But for a truth, we are not a project. We are a people." The words hit like thunder. That speech, short and raw, traveled faster than any drone. It reached young leaders in Kinshasa, activists in Accra, farmers in the Sahel. It reminded them all that what was happening in Burkina Faso wasn't isolated. It was a blueprint. And that blueprint was now under construction. In the weeks that followed, Traoré's government signed new agricultural accords with Bangladesh. Bangladesh would send experts in rice production and micro-irrigation. In return, Burkina Faso would share its methods for rural conflict resilience. India committed to expanding its solar training centers, while Turkey confirmed it would fund a new military academy, but run by Burkinabe instructors only. Cuba reopened its medical exchange, and within 3 months, the first group of Burkinabe nurses flew to Havana. Gabon proposed a regional ecological corridor to combat desertification, and Sierra Leone agreed to co-host an African peacebuilding summit, without Western sponsors. And Equatorial Guinea? They pledged funding to build a Pan-African cultural center in Ouagadougou, the place where stories would be told. True stories, African stories. Traoré didn't ask for applause. He asked for patience, for vigilance, for unity. He knew more attacks would come. Not just with guns, but with rumors, with sabotage, with backdoor diplomacy. But the line had been drawn. Burkina Faso would not be managed. It would lead, not alone, but with those who respected its path. 8 nations had stepped forward, not out of pity, but purpose. Not to control, but to collaborate. And Traoré, once mocked as a radical, now sat at the head of a table that had never before existed. An African table, set not in Paris or Washington, but in Ouagadougou. The message was clear. Africa is not rising. Africa has risen. And for the first time in a long time, the world was finally listening.